If you know so much, then teach my engineers.
If you know so much, then teach my engineers. Richard Ferguson's voice sliced through the air with mockery as sharp as a knife. He stood up from his black leather chair, pointing at Jake Miller with a sneer. Let's see if you can do what my engineers can't. You're just a shop mechanic, but if you think you're that good, teach them how to assemble this engine. I'll enjoy watching you fail in front of them. The laughter of Phoenix Motors executives echoed through the room. Jake, wearing an oil-stained shirt and calloused hands, stood at the center of the makeshift stage, surrounded by well-dressed engineers, all with disdainful eyes fixed on him. The bet was set. Ferguson knew what he was doing, humiliating those without a degree, those who didn't fit into the system he controlled. He wanted to see Jake fail. He wanted to laugh at yet another insignificant mechanic trying to prove himself in a high-tech world. Or maybe, Ferguson continued, his voice lower and more venomous, you think you understand engineering more than all of them combined. If you manage to solve this in under an hour, I'll give you $50,000. He paused, as if offering a crumb. But if you fail, you'll leave here with nothing but more humiliation and not a cent to your name. What do you say, deal or not? The room fell silent. Jake Miller knew he had no choice. The humiliation hung in the air, but he wouldn't be intimidated. With a barely noticeable sigh, he responded, his voice firm, without hesitation. Deal. And after this, I'll teach you more than you can imagine. Jake Miller crouched down and grabbed the wrench with a precise motion, like a man whose hands had been calloused by hard work for decades. The engineers from Phoenix Motors were all around him, with skeptical looks, but somehow curious. Ferguson, however, was still enjoying himself. He leaned back in his chair, a mischievous smile on his lips, watching the mechanic prepare for the impossible task. Go ahead then. Let's see how far your wisdom takes you, Ferguson said in a provocative tone, his words like knives thrown at the victim. The room was tense, filled with a heavy energy of expectation. The engineers exchanged glances, almost preparing for the big joke. Jake took a quick glance at the engine before him, the complex machine he was supposed to fix. It was nothing he hadn't seen before. On the contrary, it was the kind of work he had done hundreds of times, though never in front of such an imposing and arrogant group. With a calm and confident movement, Jake began disassembling the engine. Each piece seemed to come alive under his hands. He wasn't rushing. He knew time was against him, but he also knew that haste could be his enemy. He focused on the task while the engineers watched, all trying to maintain composure, but clearly uncomfortable with Jake's pace. This is ridiculous, said one engineer, trying to hide the discomfort in his voice. This can't be done with this type of engine. But no one dared question Jake's calmness. He was there with the quiet confidence of someone who doesn't let himself be shaken, no matter how far the goal seems. Ferguson started to grow uneasy. The arrogance that consumed him began to dissipate in the face of Jake's steady demeanor. He stood up from his chair and slowly walked over to the bench where Jake was working. The billionaire looked at the mechanic, and for a moment, the tension between them seemed thicker than the very air in the room. You're taking too long. You won't make it, Ferguson said, his tone now laden with impatience. He spoke loudly, as if he wanted everyone to witness Jake's supposed defeat. The engineers in my company are more than qualified to handle this. It's going to be a failure. The room was tense, but Jake's confidence only grew. He continued to disassemble the engine with calm and precision, as if he were in his own element. He knew Ferguson and his engineers were watching every move, waiting for the mistake that would never come. But Jake knew the biggest mistake would be proving the billionaire right. I don't need a degree to understand this, Jake thought, but didn't say anything. He knew words couldn't defeat Ferguson's arrogance. Only action could. Ferguson, in turn, was no longer enjoying himself. He began to realize that the spectacle, which he had thought would be a simple humiliation, was slipping out of control. Every move Jake made only reaffirmed an uncomfortable truth. The man in front of him understood engines more than he and his engineers combined. The billionaire's pride began to crumble, but he wasn't willing to admit it. On the contrary, he needed to prove Jake was wrong. The room, once noisy with laughter and mockery, was now silent. The tension was palpable. The engineers looked at each other, uneasy, as if they were beginning to question everything they knew. Ferguson's humiliation, though not yet perceptible to him, was already underway. Jake felt the weight of the remarks around him. Each look from the engineers, each word of disdain made the atmosphere even more charged. But he didn't let it shake him. His movements remained calm and precise. He had done this many times before, but never under the pressure of the ruthless gaze of a billionaire and his team. He wasn't there just to fix the engine. He was there to challenge the system that had underestimated him. "This is impossible," murmured one engineer, more to himself than to the others, but still filled with disbelief. "This engine won't work without a full diagnosis. He can't do this alone." Jake didn't lift his head. He didn't need to respond. The piece he was removing was exactly in the right place, and the engine was starting to yield to his skill. Ferguson, however, could not let this continue. He was losing the upper hand, and it frustrated him in a way he didn't like to admit. The arrogant smile he had maintained now seemed like a disguise, a shield for the growing discomfort. "You really think this is going to work?" he asked, with a dismissive tone, trying to regain his authority. "These engineers here are the best in the world, not whatever you can teach them. You're just a shop guy. Do you even know what a real engine is?" But Jake didn't answer. Instead, he leaned a little closer to the engine, his face illuminated only by the cold light of the fluorescent lamps. The engineers began to move closer, trying to understand what he was doing. Some watched in silence, while others whispered among themselves, but Jake, unhurried, seemed oblivious to any comment. The room was quieter now. Even Ferguson seemed to be running out of words, frustrated that he couldn't understand what was happening. He watched as the mechanic disassembled the engine as if he were assembling a puzzle, fitting the pieces together with flawless precision. The arrogance he had tried to impose had become a burden, and now he felt his bet beginning to wilt in the face of the man's skill he had underestimated. "You can't be serious," said Ferguson, more to himself than to Jake, trying to maintain control. He stepped back slightly, as if he needed more space to process what was happening. "This isn't engineering. This is a trick." Jake looked at him for the first time, but his response was simple, almost emotionless. "It's not a trick, Mr. Ferguson. It's knowledge." The words echoed in the room, and the tension that had been building between them began to spread to the others present. The engineers began to watch more closely, and a tense silence fell over the room. They were no longer laughing. They were no longer mocking. They were finally starting to see, and more importantly, they were beginning to question everything they knew about the value of practical experience, something a university degree could never replace. The pressure then began to shift, no longer on Jake. Now it was focused on Ferguson, the man who, with a simple bet, had caused the collapse of his own arrogance. He had invited Jake to teach his engineers, but now he was being forced to attend a lesson in humility. Jake, unhurried, made the final adjustment to the engine. He connected it to the test system and pressed the start button. The sound of the engine firing up was like a blow to Ferguson's ego. What he had thought impossible was working. The engine, which no one had been able to get to run, was now purring perfectly. Ferguson, visibly shaken, had no words. The entire room was looking at Jake, and for the first time, the engineers moved closer to him with genuine respect. It was no longer just about teaching, but about understanding that in that moment true competence stood before them, without pomp, without a degree, but with something far more valuable, unbeatable practice. "This can't be true," said one of the engineers, the first to step forward. He extended his hand, no longer with disdain but with silent respect. Jake didn't respond. He simply looked at the engine, which was running as it should, and felt a sense of victory that didn't need any explanation. Ferguson stood still, eyes wide. He had lost, but more than that, his humiliation was about to become public. The conference room was heavy, laden with an awkward silence. The engine, which just moments ago had been considered an impossible challenge, was now purring with flawless smoothness. The tension that once dominated the room began to shift, but not in the direction Ferguson had expected. The engineers began to approach Jake, one by one, their expressions a mix of disbelief and respect. There were no applause, but the way they positioned themselves around him, watching the engine run perfectly, said everything. Ferguson's arrogance, which had once dominated the room, now seemed like a distant shadow. "It doesn't make sense." "How did he do that?" murmured one of the engineers, still trying to understand what had happened. "We spent weeks trying to get this engine to work, and he made it look easy." Ferguson, however, was not ready to accept the reality unfolding before him. The man he had called a junkyard mechanic had just done something the best engineers at Phoenix Motors couldn't, and that destabilized him more than he could admit. Humiliation was slowly being sown, and each piece that fit into the engine felt like a strike to the billionaire's ego. "This isn't engineering," Ferguson shouted, trying to regain control of the situation, but his voice came out weak, almost without confidence. "It's impossible. This engine shouldn't work like this. Are you seeing this? This is a trick." But Ferguson's words no longer echoed with the engineers. They looked at Jake not with disdain, but with a kind of admiration they could no longer hide. The simple man, the one Ferguson had ridiculed, was now in the center of the room, as a symbol of everything arrogance and prejudice could destroy. Jake, arms crossed, looked at Ferguson with an unwavering calm. There was no need to speak anymore. The engine was running. He had won the bet. But more than that, he had challenged the very system that had excluded him. Ferguson was being exposed, not just as a billionaire, but as someone who believed money could buy everything, even the truth. The engineers, who had been silent before, now exchanged knowing glances. The atmosphere in the room had shifted radically. The billionaire, who had once stood ready to humiliate the mechanic, was now sitting, visibly shaken, his eyes fixed on the engine as if trying to understand what had just happened. He couldn't accept it. What had seemed like a simple bet was now turning into a public defeat. "So, Ferguson," Jake said, finally breaking the silence, "I think you've got something to learn, don't you?" His voice was calm, but with a firmness that made the billionaire shrink. The engineers began to move closer, some extending their hands, others simply observing Jake with a new perspective. The mechanic, who had once been the subject of ridicule, was now at the center of the room, at the center of a truth that could no longer be ignored. He had done what no one thought possible. Ferguson, in turn, was in shock. His mind tried to process what was happening, but nothing made sense. He had challenged a simple man, and now that man was being revered by the engineers he himself had considered the best. The fall was imminent, but Ferguson was still trying with all his strength to maintain control. He stood up, trying to regain his composure. "It can't be like this," said Ferguson, his voice weaker. This is impossible." But as he looked at the engineers, he saw what he feared most. They were no longer on his side. They were slowly backing away from him, with the look of those beginning to see the truth. "You won, Jake," said one of the engineers, finally, in a quiet voice. "We were wrong. This is impressive." The word impressive was the final blade of steel driven into Ferguson's chest. He was being stripped of his power in front of everyone, and this, more than anything, made him furious. The room, which had once been filled with derisive laughter, was now silent. Everyone looked at Jake, who stood at the center, immune to the weight of the words still echoing in the engineers' heads. He hadn't done more than his duty. He wasn't there to prove anything, but the truth he had revealed could not be ignored. The very power structure, which he had never been invited to be a part of, was crumbling. Ferguson was losing, and he knew it. The humiliation, although subtle at first, was now palpable. Ferguson, the man who held billions, the owner of Phoenix Motors, was being stripped of his mask of superiority. He tried to hide his discomfort with a forced smile, but everyone in the room could see it. His confidence was disintegrating. Jake, on the other hand, remained calm. The engine was running perfectly. The team of engineers observed him with a reverence he had never imagined. The bet was won, but what he didn't expect was the weight of it. The moment of transformation, not just for him, but for everyone in the room. He felt that something much bigger was at play. It wasn't just about winning the bet. It was about truth, about the justice unfolding in that space. Ferguson, now restless, stood up and took a few steps across the room. The sound of his shoes clicking on the cold floor seemed to echo throughout the room, reflecting the growing anger within him. He stopped in front of Jake, eyes wide, trying to regain control of the situation. You don't understand," Ferguson said, but his voice wavered. He tried to ignore the fact that the engineers now saw him with a mix of disdain and pity, as if they were trying to figure out what he, the billionaire, was doing wrong. "This isn't how things work. You can't just walk in here and do this." But Jake, with an uncommon calmness, looked directly into Ferguson's eyes. He no longer felt anger or humiliation. He only felt the satisfaction of what he knew was just. He didn't need to shout to win. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone because his skill was already speaking for him. "I understand more than you think," Jake said, his voice steady. Maybe you're good at selling illusions, Ferguson, but you've never understood the true value of hard work, of experience. What you do or try to do is build castles in the air. And that engine, it works because it's real. The engineers, once hesitant, were now moving away from Ferguson, as if they wanted to give space for the truth to be revealed. Ferguson felt the loss of control. He was being stripped of his authority, and he knew it. "This isn't engineering," he repeated, but now his voice sounded desperate. He tried to cling to what little credibility he had left, but it was slipping through his fingers like sand. "You don't know what real engineering is." Jake didn't move. He had already done what he needed to do. Ferguson's humiliation was no longer within his control. The billionaire had put himself in a position where his own arrogance would condemn him, and nothing could change that now. He had bet against the wrong person. And as always happens, karma was about to have the last word. If you were more humble, Ferguson, maybe you would have learned something. But you chose to underestimate me. Now, see the result. Ferguson looked around trying to find support, but there was no one left. The room, once a palace of laughter and superiority, was now empty of backing. His engineers, his employees, were backing away from him, unsure of what to do. The battle was lost. The only thing he could try to do now was minimize the disaster, but it was too late. The audience had spoken, and this time, the billionaire was the defeated one. What happened next was inevitable, like the collapse of an empire that, at its peak, thought nothing could bring it down. Ferguson, stunned, tried to maintain control, but his eyes darted erratically around the room, now clearly against him. There was no one left to support him. Jake's words echoed in his mind like a heavy blow with every breath. "You know, Ferguson," Jake began again, his tone softer now. "It's not just about engines. It's not just about knowing how to tighten bolts and adjust parts. This is about recognition. And you don't know what that means." He looked around at the engineers in the room, now with a new light in their eyes. "You're lucky to be surrounded by talented people, but what you didn't realize is that their value isn't in a luxury office or in a name on a diploma. It's in the work, in the sweat. That's how things work, Ferguson." The billionaire, who had once been so sure of his position, of his status, now couldn't find the words anymore. He tried, but they didn't come out. What should have been a sharp, relentless response, a defense of his arrogance, was nothing more than a sigh. He mumbled something, but no one was listening anymore. And it was at that moment that the weight of the truth hit him. Ferguson was being exposed. He was no longer the powerful man of Phoenix Motors. He was just the billionaire who had humiliated the wrong man. A man who hadn't been there to put on a show, but to show that true value didn't come from money or degrees. It came from experience, dedication, and respect. The engineers, now free from any pressure, began to approach Jake one by one. The first to speak was the lead engineer, who had previously looked at Jake with disdain. Now his voice was full of respect and recognition. You are a master," he said, and his words were followed by a wave of nods from the other engineers, who were finally free from Ferguson's manipulation. They were starting to understand that true wisdom wasn't in titles, not in the facade of perfection that billionaires displayed. It was in the calloused hands of someone who truly knew what they were doing. Ferguson stood still, his face red with both rage and shame. He tried to look away, but he couldn't anymore. He knew his defeat was total. Not only had he been humiliated in front of all the engineers, but also in front of the world. His arrogance had turned into a chain of mistakes. "Don't you have anything else to say?" Jake asked with a calm that cut through the tension. "Because I still have something to ask." Ferguson, unable to find any form of resistance, just looked at Jake. He knew that whatever came next would be the final blow. And he was right. "I want you to say it out loud, in front of everyone, that a mechanic, the one you ridiculed, showed you what he's truly capable of doing." The room fell silent. Ferguson, with no way out, closed his eyes. His humiliation was now complete. He had never imagined that a simple man without the credentials he so valued could dismantle his mask of invincibility. But there was Jake Miller, unhurried, not shouting, simply asserting himself with his competence. And justice was being done. Ferguson's public humiliation didn't need to be anything more than that. The loss of his arrogance in front of all those who had once seen him as the epitome of success. Now, everyone knew the truth. Jake Miller had won, and no one, Not even the billionaire could change that. The room was now completely silent, as if the weight of what had just happened still hung in the air. Ferguson, the man who thought he was invincible, who had always had everything within his reach, was now facing a public defeat he could no longer deny. The billionaire was in ruins, no longer at the center of power, but standing before an unrelenting truth, exposed for all to see. And the room, once filled with laughter and mockery, had now become a court of justice. Jake, with his quiet calm, knew that the greatest victory didn't come from humiliating Ferguson, but from exposing the hypocrisy the billionaire represented. He didn't want glory. The truth was finally being revealed to everyone present. He looked at the engineers who were now around him, recognizing not only his skill but also the value of experience, hard work, and the humility that Ferguson, deep down, had never possessed. "I didn't need this, Ferguson," Jake finally said, his voice firm but not angry. "I didn't want to win your bet, but when you chose to challenge me, you chose more than just a mechanic. You chose to challenge a man who, no matter how simple he was, would never let his dignity be destroyed." The engineers were now standing, watching everything unfold. The transformation was clear. They looked at Jake with genuine respect, something Ferguson would never receive. But above all, there was something greater at play here. Justice. It was the karma of a man who had always had everything but never had what truly mattered. Ferguson, defeated, looked at the floor, trying in vain to regain some control he had lost. But the truth was relentless. He could no longer sustain his facade. Every word Jake said, every look from the engineers, every movement in the room, was like an additional weight crushing what remained of his self-sufficiency. "You wanted to humiliate me," Jake continued without raising his voice. "But now who's being humiliated is you. It's not me. It's not the engineers. It's you, Ferguson. There's nothing left to prove. The truth is, before everyone. And there, before everyone, Ferguson's humiliation didn't come from aggressive words, but from the simple display of what he feared most. True competence, a skill that cannot be bought, forged, or disrespected. Ferguson, the man who thought his wealth protected him, was now exposed as the man who never understood that true strength wasn't in his billions, but in the sincerity of work and the humility of knowing there is always something to learn. The billionaire had no more answers. He only had shame, and the worst for him. He knew that no matter how hard he tried to recover, no one in that room would ever see him the same way again. The stain of defeat could not be erased. Jake Miller, on the other hand, didn't need to shout his victory. He didn't need to put on a spectacle. He had won, and the only thing the audience needed to understand was that justice, even in a simple way, always arrives. Karma had been served, not with revenge, but with the simple twist of a truth that always prevails. As the engineers began to leave one by one, greeting Jake with respect, Ferguson remained motionless, his posture of power completely undone. He had no more words to say. The last shred of his dignity had been publicly ripped away, and he knew nothing could restore it. And at that moment, Jake Miller, the junkyard mechanic, was recognized by those who truly mattered, his peers, the men who worked with their hands and minds, but had never received the recognition they deserved. And in the end, that was the greatest victory of all. The billionaire, lost in his own arrogance, was left behind. Karma, unrelenting, had been fulfilled. If you were impacted by this story and want to see more twists like this, don't waste any time. Subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications to be the first to watch when new stories of karma and justice unfold. In the meantime, enjoy the next video that's playing on your screen. You won't want to miss what's coming. Every story is a lesson, and I'm sure this one will keep you hooked from start to finish. Be sure to check it out.